just love a bargain? Don't you just love a bargain? Don't you just love a bargain?
All right, many of us remember that jingle. Now, a new book entitled The Christmas Tree Shop's Don't You Just Love a Bargain looks at the history behind the store. Joining us now is the book's author, Anthony Sammarco. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So, we're going to start with the Christmas Tree Shop, a business that began shortly after World War II, correct?
Well, it started in 1946 by the Matthews family, who had actually come to Cape Cod from New York. They started a store that was a remainder store, but it was only open from Memorial Day until Labor Day. And, of course, with the blue laws during that time, it was never open on Sunday. But it continued until 1970, and at that point it was purchased by Doreen and Chuck Bilezikian, who actually created what we know of as the Christmas Tree Shops.
And actually, they bought it kind of on a whim?
Well, it wasn't just on a whim, but the company had gone bankrupt in 1961. The Matthews sold it to a man by the name of Don Winter, and he continued it until 1970. At that point, the Bilezikians were having a July 4th weekend vacation on Cape Cod. And, of course, Chuck Bilezikian, who was employed by Cambridge Coffee, Tea, and Spice Company, had some stock he was trying to unload. He went to Don Winter at the Christmas Tree Shop. It was a singular at that point. And after their discussion, he said casually, "Would you like to buy a business?" And in that instance, they did. And they went into debt, not only giving him $10,000 on credit cards, but eventually selling their house in Newton and purchasing the business and moving above the store, so to speak, lock, stock, and barrel.
Now, I got to ask you the unique name, because I've been to the Christmas Tree Shops many times throughout my childhood and whatnot. I don't recall ever getting a Christmas tree there.
Well, I think in a lot of ways that was something they were trying to downplay. It was something in a lot of ways that did offer Christmas trees, Christmas ornaments, Christmas decorations. Initially, the Matthews, when they started it in 1947, would greet people Merry Christmas when they walked through the door, not hello or welcome. But 1970 to the 1980s, the Bilezikians were trying to make this something that was not just a remainder store that sold off, of course, surplus stock and things of that sort, but they tried to find, in many instances, very unique items. And in many ways, it was not just local Cape Cod artists that provided things such as Pizzi glass, which were beautiful stained glass ornaments of birds and lighthouses, but they would also, in that instance, begin to offer everything under the sun. But it wasn't always in huge amounts. Remember, it's a remainder store, a discounted store, but they wanted to make it into an upscale gift shop, but at a bargain. And I think one of the concepts here was they did actually come up with that adage, "Don't you just love a bargain?" And people did. It was something that attracted people of all walks of life, never knowing what they would find when they arrived.
Yeah, because it seems like a lot of people I know who went to the Christmas Tree Shop, they kind of it was sort of like the thrill of the hunt, so to speak.
I agree. I think in a lot of ways I always went basically for the same staples, basically Christmas cards, greeting cards, birthday cards, but I also had various nuts and candies for people that I knew that were elderly, and I knew that I would actually get a great bargain on these things, and they enjoyed them. But I think it was the thrill of the hunt. And in the book, I say in one adage that you never knew you needed it until you arrived.
Because that was the thing, is the Christmas Tree Shops wasn't the first, certainly wasn't the only bargain shop, so to speak.
Correct.
But it really seemed to stand out from some of the others.
Well, it did. I think in a lot of ways when we think of remainder stores, there are many that actually come to mind. Probably the Bargain Center in Quincy Square. We also today have Ocean State Job Lot. But the whole concept was the Christmas Tree Shops, which did start, as we saw in Yarmouth Port, which was basically just a small assemblage of things that they had gathered together, would grow into an iconic store. And it wasn't just the merchandise. The Bilezikians would design each new building to be something that was not only attractive, but also drawing from its local source. So when they built initially a building in Hyannis, it was adjacent to the railroad yard which connected Hyannis and Boston. They built their new store that looked like a railroad depot, and they bought 4 railroad cars from the New Haven line, which had recently gone bankrupt, and added them to that assemblage. They would actually build a sea captain's house in Orleans. They'd build a lighthouse in Linfield. And, of course, at the Sagamore Bridge, which I personally feel is their iconic signature store, they created a stone Irish cottage with the largest thatch roof in the world. So these weren't just places that were to shop. They were an attractive destination. And whether one went with family or friends, it was something in some ways that seemed like a day out, and people loved it.
Because, I mean, the Bilezikian family definitely really put their own stamp on it. This wasn't just like you said, just a regular franchise store. They really wanted it to be unique and different.
They did. And Chuck Bilezikian actually had taken a business administration course at Suffolk. He had worked initially at Gilchrist and later at the Cambridge Coffee, Tea, and Spice Company. Doreen Bilezikian was educated at Boston State to be a teacher, but she was working as a social worker. So this was really hands-on training, and it was something that not only did they unpack boxes, stock the shelves, open the doors, run the cash registers, it was on-the-job training, and they basically created something that not only did people enjoy going to, but they returned.
And one of the big things that they had was, were they going to go over the bridge?
Correct.
That was a big debate.
Well, by the 1970s, and I did a lot of discussion with Doreen Bilezikian. Her husband, unfortunately, died in 2016. But she said by 1975 they knew they were going to actually make it. And at that point, they not only had 7 stores on Cape Cod, but they opened one in Pembroke, Massachusetts, which in that instance was across the bridge, which they never anticipated doing. But it would spur on, by the period of 2003, 23 stores throughout New England and one in New York.
And, of course, that expansion and their success got the attention of a larger corporate entity that ended up basically kind of taking them over.
Well, I think in a lot of ways it wasn't just the consumer that actually knew what bargains were available at the Christmas tree shops. Bed Bath & Beyond probably had been gauging it for quite a few years. But at the turn of the 20th century, we realized in some ways that this was a company that was drawing in millions. It was the largest employer on Cape Cod, but it was a major employer throughout Massachusetts. And in that instance, they were making a profit. And in that way, I think Bed Bath & Beyond, which is something in some ways that was another major entity, looked at this as a profitable concern, and they made a cash offer. The Bilezikians said that they had never intended, they weren't even looking to sell the business, but the offer of $200 million was incredible, something that they had started in debt and now was worth an incredible sum of money. And we have to remember this is 20 years ago, so it's probably the equivalent to $500 million today. They sold it, but they also stayed on for 3 years to ensure a smooth transition. And in that way, Chuck, as a major consultant to Bed Bath & Beyond, and Doreen, who ran the advertising department, were integral, because what they did was to stabilize the business after its sale, so employees didn't actually become concerned or frightened that they were going to lose their jobs. And yes, Bed Bath & Beyond for the next 20 years will continue to expand this. And it was something in some ways that became even more prevalent with newspaper articles, radio, television commercials. It really was something that was ingrained in people's minds.
Now, at some point, of course, things stopped going as well as they had. When exactly did that start to happen, and why?
Well, by 2020, Bed Bath & Beyond realized in some ways they probably had expanded it as much as they really could. They were approached by a company called Handle Holdings, a husband and wife team that actually looked at the business and said, we can do probably better than Bed Bath & Beyond and the Bilezikians combined. They bought the company purportedly for $475 million, and what they decided to do was to rapidly expanded, and it was within 16 states with almost 90 stores. But what they did was to expand these stores as pop-up shops. They weren't full-fledged Christmas tree shops, nor did they have a thatched roof or a lighthouse or a sea captain's mansion. All of those things were such wonderful, iconic aspects of the business that now a pop-up shop had no character or soul. Well, unfortunately, it was also the pandemic. And the pandemic meant that most of us were, unfortunately, remaining at home. And very few people could either go to a shop or even these new pop-up shops. By the period of 2023, they were actually losing money. And it wasn't just the fact that they had debt, but they could not refinance the debt. And they actually created, in some ways, a Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which a federal judge eventually ruled would be a Chapter 7, which would be a liquidation bankruptcy. So they could sell everything they could, every bit of stock, shelving, decorations, anything of that sort, to pay off the $45 million of debt that they couldn't refinance. And in that way, I think everyone in Boston, let alone around the country that had ever been to the Christmas tree shops, was shocked. How could a business that we all knew as a success declare bankruptcy? And not only was it in our local newspapers and local radio stations, even here at WATD, but we also realized in that instance it was something that was reported by the Wall Street Journal. So the Christmas tree shops, and I call this in the last chapter a lament for the Christmas tree shops, had declared bankruptcy, and they went out of business. And I was contacted by Doreen Bilezikian asking if I would consider writing this book. Well, I thought to myself, if it was of great interest to me, I'm sure the public would enjoy something that would actually create a little bit of a lament for a once-beloved business.
Now, I also, before we touch on that a little bit, I noticed that for a while, kind of towards the end, they tried a little bit of a rebranding. I believe they call themselves CTS.
Correct. Well, the Christmas tree shops, in a lot of ways, is a nice full mouthful. But CTS was something that not only created the new branded image, but it was also, they called themselves And All That, instead of Don't You Just Love a Bargain. They were trying to modernize it, and they were trying to make it into something a little bit more hip, a little bit more groovy. I think in a lot of ways they failed, because people knew the Christmas tree shops as something that might have been the perfect place if one was on Cape Cod for a summer vacation. It was a rainy day. The place was mobbed. But by the period of 2023, again, just at the time the pandemic began to wind down, people looked at all of this new branding and jamming of aisles in these stores that were just so chock-a-block with things, as well as pop-up shops. It had really lost its character. And I think the rebranding of CTS and All That was something that in a lot of ways changed people's perceptions of it.
Now, I wanted to ask you, in the course of doing this book, did you learn anything that surprised you?
Well, I was fascinated with it, and for 6 months I lived the Christmas tree shops. I read everything there was about it, but what surprised me was how a husband and a wife could sell their house and put the proceeds of that into a business, leave Newton, Massachusetts to live above the store in what was basically a cold water flat with 2 young children, and rebrand their lives into something that they didn't know if it was going to be a success. So I think in some ways, having been in business myself, I looked at this as something that they had created, not only a wonderful store as an attractive place to shop and, of course, a place for bargains, but that they had actually persevered and, their on-the-job business acumen made it into something that was a success. I loved it. I think in a lot of ways when I did this book, I looked at scrapbooks and every newspaper clipping that I could, and I honestly felt I was only one of millions who actually admired what had been done. And I think the Bilezikians are owed a debt of thanks for what they had done between 1970 and 2003. Even though they did actually sell it, they always kept abreast. And the surprising thing that you ask, I learned was that when the Bilezikians sold the business, they didn't sell the stores or the property. They only sold the name. So for the next 20-some-odd years, Bed Bath & Beyond and Handel Holdings would actually pay lease rent. And in that instance, it was something in a lot of ways that still continued. And, of course, these buildings are still owned by the Bilezikian family.
How can people get this book?
Ironically, it was supposed to be out before Christmas, but it'll be available at any major bookstore. It is $25. It's chock-a-block with photographs, most of them in color, but it gives in some ways not only the aspects of the beginnings, but also right through to the end and the hows and whys of the business and, unfortunately, what happened in the very end. It's a book, I think, in some ways, it's much like my other books on Jordan Marsh, S.S. Pierce, Howard Johnson's, Baker's Chocolate. These are businesses in some ways that were once a part of our lives and a major employer of people in Massachusetts. But like the Christmas tree shop, I guess there's a time and a place for everything, and it has come to pass that it has gone out of business. But we remember, and it's a fond memory from the past.
All right, well, once again, the book is The Christmas Tree Shops, Don't You Just Love a Bargain? And we were joined today by author Anthony Sammarco. Thank you so much for joining us. We do appreciate it.
I thank you for inviting me.